Welcome to Organizing Your Work Fundamentals of Prioritization. I am Joe Reimers, and I'm joined by Christine Schultz, who is at the top of the screen. Hello, Christine.
Hello.
And she is appearing remote today. So, yes, welcome. And without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So today, really, this is about how we organize our work, how we figure out what we do in what order. We're going to learn about different prioritization techniques. Both Christine and I are product owners, so our perspective comes from organizing product development, but we're going to also talk in general terms about other types of prioritization and just generally how to manage your time to be most effective. And hopefully we'll at least give you some concepts and ways to work that will just help you structure things more efficiently. And there are a number of different techniques and ways of thinking that apply to various situations. So we also want to help you identify the most effective techniques for a given situation. And then for practicing prioritization, Christine and I are going to show you a couple practical examples of what we did and hopefully field some examples on that. I don't know if we're going to be able to have the opportunity to get into a real life prioritization exercise because there are a number of challenges with that, but see what we can do. So first, we want to get into some basic prioritization basics. And I want to start with multitasking is a lie. People believe they can multitask, but in reality, we can only be doing one thing at one time for the most part. I know we see on cooking shows, you know, sometimes you'll see somebody stirring two pots at the same time, but in reality, you're doing something while something else is happening in the background and calling that multitasking, but you cannot be dicing onions at the same time that you're stirring a batter. You have to be doing one or the other. So what we think of as multitasking is actually rapid context switching, and context switching slows us down. So part of what prioritization is about is focusing on what you need to be focusing on and minimizing the distractions and minimizing that context switching. Just as a really practical example, I'm sure every one of us has had projects where we've had to put our head down and just, you know, think, get into it, get into that zone and work on what we're working on. And then somebody walks up and asks a completely unrelated question, or you get like an alert that it's time for a meeting or something else that just pulls you out of what you're doing. And then you do that, and then you have to go back in. And depending on what you're doing, it can take 20 minutes to half an hour before you're back in the zone. And that 20 minutes to half an hour of getting back in the zone is really what kills efficiency and productivity. So you want to minimize that. The other part is we want to minimize the amount of time figuring out what we're supposed to be doing right now. It should just be there. Do this, then do this. And then the last a couple last components is you have a really big job, a really, really big job. Like you're moving a collection from place A to place B. And there are a lot of moving parts involved with that. So figuring out how do I take this very complex thing and make it manageable? And how do I bring order to chaos? And one of the things I'm going to talk about is I'm one of the product owners for Thunderjet. We manage the acquisitions backlog in Folio. And when I joined the team, we had a backlog in Jira of about 10 to 12 years worth of work. And when you have a backlog that big, you don't really have a manageable backlog because it's too much. It's overwhelming. So getting that in some sort of structure where you can say, what do I need to be focusing on right now is a critical component of prioritization. Next slide, please. Now, as mentioned, Christine and I are both product owners on the Folio project. It is an open source project. If you are focusing on product owners in particular and looking up prioritization techniques, a lot of them also talk about business value, return on investment, that sort of thing. And in an open source project, that's a little bit less important because you're not so much interested in generating revenue. You're really interested in best, I don't want to say bang for the buck, but basically the biggest bang in terms of community value and productivity. So we're focusing on techniques that really favor functionality and user experience. And then market adoption is also a component because we want to make something that makes people want to use Folio. We're still a growing community, and a bigger community is better for everyone. So we want to grow that community, but we're not really thinking about, well, it's going to cost us this many dollars because, that's really not so much a factor in what we're doing. So there are probably a couple of prioritization techniques that you may have seen that we're not really going to focus on because they're not relevant or not as relevant to an open source project like weighted shortest job first, because the cost isn't really a factor, or the return on investment for the business is not as much of a factor, which is good for users. Next slide, please. All right, so let's start with a few basic prioritization techniques, and we're going to start with the most basic of the basic, which is the Eisenhower matrix. That is, if any of you have read Stephen Covey's Seven Habits of Highly Effective People, you'll recognize this. And it basically breaks things down in terms of importance and urgency. So it's great for just generally setting up your day. How do I allocate my time? It is not specific to software development or product development, but it is great for just, what am I going to do? And as I said, so the method there is you're looking at the things that are on your to-do list, and you're separating them out based on relative importance and urgency. It's quick. It's applicable to a very great many use cases. Anyone can do it, but it's not empirical. And when you're finished, you end up with kind of it's not exactly prioritized. You just know which group of things need to be done, but the exact order in which you do them is still somewhat fluid. But in most cases, that's fine. So if you have a to-do list, if you have, 16 things, all of which, have to get done, how do you know what to focus on first? And it's really helpful in terms of managing your time, so you're not wasting your time on little things. Next slide, please. Then this is the simple Eisenhower matrix with an explanation of how it's to be applied. So you have things that are important and not important, and urgent and not urgent. So if it's important and urgent, it means you need to do it. So that should be the first thing on your list of things that you do. If it's important and not urgent, that means schedule it. Block out time in your calendar to do that. And it's important to block out that time to do it so you make sure it gets done. Otherwise, you're going to have all your time filled up with unimportant things that are allegedly urgent. I actually took a 7 Habits class, and they illustrated this by having a glass jar and a bunch of large blocks and pebbles. And if you dump in the pebbles and then try to put all the blocks in, it overflows because the blocks just take up too much space. But if you put the blocks in, which are your scheduled tasks, then fill it with the pebbles, which is all the extra stuff, then it actually works because you've made space for the important but not urgent tasks. So that's why that's really important to block that time. Not important, but urgent, delegate it if you can. See if there's somebody else who can take care of it. Because if it's not important, but there's urgency, that means your skill set isn't required. So it means somebody else can probably do it. And then if it's not important and not urgent, why waste your time doing it? I mean, it's a fair question. If it's not important and it's not urgent, it's fair to ask, does it really need to be done? Next slide, please. The next prioritization technique that I want to talk about briefly, oh, actually, with a little bit more in depth, is Moscow. Moscow is an abbreviation for must have, should have, could have, won't have. And the goal there is to determine the value based on known goals. So you need to know your outcome. I'm a product owner, so I'm working on, in my case, I work on acquisitions. So what is absolutely essential? What should it have? What could it have? And what are we not going to do? And this is great for just looking through and arranging, as well as trimming all the tasks that are potentially associated with that. And basically, you categorize every piece of work or every feature or every proposed bit of functionality into a category of must have, should have, could have, won't have. Pros to the Moscow method is it's very quick and easy. It's very good for large backlogs. This is what I use for my large project. I'm going to show you what that looks like in a few minutes. And a single person can do it, or a very small team can do it. The drawback is it's not really empirical. You're not looking at any sort of real value. Like you're not looking at empirical data. You're not looking at market feedback. You're just kind of sorting based on what you know. It still doesn't result in an absolute hierarchy, which is what I mean by stack rank. So you put one on the top, two second, three third, and so forth. This, just like with the Eisenhower matrix, you're just putting it into a column, which you then have to further refine. The other major danger is that you risk over or undervaluing certain things. And in particular, it's super easy with Moscow to put way too many things in the must do column. And if you have too many things as absolutely must do, you have too many, then you don't really have a must do column. So I tend to reserve that for pretty specific cases. And then again, as mentioned, I use it for managing very large backlogs and narrowing focus. Do I have another Moscow slide? Yeah, okay. So this is just what I do, but I want to break this down a little bit because must, should, could, won't are fairly self-explanatory, but not obvious. So in a product perspective, must have means its core functionality, the bare minimum required to make it work. Should have is where you get from making it work to making it work well, making it work efficiently, making it competitive with other products that are out there, that kind of thing. And there's a lot of should out there. Could have seems like it's a low priority, but it's actually a very interesting space because a could have also gives you room for things that are innovations. Also things that are very desirable to some libraries, but not at all of interest to others. There's a lot of ways to look at could have, but really I put could have as things I want to take a closer look at. And then won't have, I'm saying at least for now, because there's a reason somebody took the time to say this feature ought to be in there. So you want to evaluate that. At the same time, I mentioned when I started, we had a 10-year backlog. And the cold hard facts are if it's 10 years and it's not scheduled, there's a real question as to whether it's actually going to happen. And if it is going to happen, is it going to happen in the same way? Because in 10 years, a lot of things change and a lot of approaches change and the architecture changes. So at minimum, you're going to need to go back and look at it with fresh eyes. So I don't feel too bad about marking things as won't have, because I can always go back and undo that later on if the need arises. But I also can't manage 120 features when I'm trying to pick out 4 for an upcoming release. So I think at this point, I want to show you a little bit about what a Moscow looks like. So I'm going to step over. Oh, this is going to be fun. This is where technology becomes a little bit of a challenge. Okay, Christine, can you hear me?
I can.
But you, and am I loud enough back there? Okay, good. Okay, so this here is a Moscow board that I created in Miro. And I've modified it a little bit because the backlog was so enormous. So I broke it down into must-have, technical should-have for tech debt, hardening, enhancements, and so forth. Functional should-haves, so new feature work. Integration should-haves. Then I went to could-have, won't do, and then I had added things that can be refined further and features that might properly belong to another team because they were originally put on us, but are we really the best people to do it? You'll notice that the must-have is empty, and there's a reason for that. Because this is, or was, our unscheduled backlog. So all of our features that had nothing assigned to a release, or were not assigned to a release, and just figuring out where things were. So if I have a must-have feature that has no release assigned, I need to get it assigned to a release because it's a must-have. Excuse me? Oh, that's because, it's coming out through that speaker. So the reason there's no must-have is because anything that was a must-have got scheduled. And then I broke down the should-have into 3 categories because I had a lot of should-haves. And so I needed a little bit more categorization just to tame that, so that when I'm building up future releases, I have X amount of bandwidth for technical, X amount of bandwidth for new functionality, and X amount of bandwidth for integrations. So that is the short version of how we did this particular Moscow, and we got it tamed. And then when we went to setting up the next release, we said, we are only going to look at the should-haves. Everything else we can set aside because it's not relevant. Are there any questions on Moscow before we move on? Okay. I'm going to stop sharing and pass things over to Christine.
Thank you so much, Joe. So the next method I wanted to focus on is another matrix. So it's like the Eisenhower matrix that Joe just presented. This one's called impact versus effort. So the goal is to focus on the impact of the idea, the feature, what have you, the impact to users or stakeholders, but to also understand the resources required to come up with a realistic plan moving forward. It's relatively simple, it's nice and visual. It seeks to maximize the given resources, but also minimize scope creep by making sure to focus on those items with highest impact. Some of the pitfalls of this method, though, are that it can be rather subjective. It also relies on the ability to create accurate estimates, which, as we know, can be challenging, especially if it's something complex like software. Like many of the methods you'll hear about today, the impact effort matrix is helpful for a large backlog of ideas, but especially if we need to think about resources and long-term planning as we're going ahead. So here's what the matrix looks like, and you'll recognize a very similar 4-quadrant format as the Eisenhower. Here, the x-axis is effort and the y-axis is impact. In the upper left-hand quadrant, this represents the ideas that have the highest impact but lowest effort. So we should probably prioritize these first. They might be thought of as quick wins, or as Joe, you said, biggest bang for your buck. The lower left-hand quadrant are items that have low impact and low effort, but these aren't ones that should just be thrown away, because they could be great fill-ins if we find out we have some capacity and we still want to add some value. Then the upper right-hand quadrant represents the items that are both high in impact and high in effort. These are important to deliver because they're so high in impact, but because of the effort required, we really need to be careful about planning them, as well as maybe thinking of strategies to implement, as like splitting them up to make it a little iterative. Finally, the lower right-hand quadrant. These items are high in effort, but low in impact. Some frameworks would consider these as ideas you should kind of toss aside. Personally, I think of it more of like a reconsider box. Maybe there are a lot of unknowns, or maybe like Joe said, it's been hanging around for a while and we might need to even revisit it to figure out what's still relevant, what do we need to support. So it doesn't necessarily mean to not do these things, like won't do doesn't necessarily mean won't ever do, but it requires careful planning before moving ahead. So now I wanted to show the matrix in action with a use case, because I am a folio PO and I work on MARC cataloging and searching in inventory and the MARC authority records. I wanted to walk through how we might use this as we plan to support, or as we were working through planning to support original cataloging in folio, as an example. So let's say we have this big idea to figure out how to support original cataloging in folio. We go through the requirements, we talk to as many people as possible, and after careful analysis, we generate a bunch of ideas and we're able to plot them onto this impact effort matrix. So here is the bucket of our ideas. Some of them we have creating original MARC bib records, doing the same with MARC authority records, some contextual help or drop downs for the 008 and quick MARC, the MARC editor. We have some save and go as functionality, some enhancements to local authority file management, configurability of MARC validation rules, cataloging version history, and finally MARC templates. So we've got a good mix of ideas we've generated in our analysis. We've got a good quicker win, I would say, with creating MARC bibs from the UI, a handful of good ideas for fill-ins when we have some time, a good amount that would be high impact, but so maybe we should kind of carefully plan and tease those out. And then one with a little bit of uncertainty to take into account. So now we've plotted our ideas, but like, what do we do with it next? I personally like to then stack rank them, taking into account all of the effort we've decided to apply and their impact. So moving on to the next, admittedly, very busy slide and chaotic. Stay with me here. On the left is the original matrix we just looked at, and on the right is how we might, in this example, how we could plan it out. Here it's kind of laid out like a release, a software release, and how we might distribute that work. So we're going to start from the top. We prioritize first our quicker win. Again, I want to emphasize the relativity of quick, and that would be creating the MARC bib records. Because it's quicker, we have some remaining capacity that we could throw in a fill-in or a lower effort item, such as adding the 008 contextual help to make it easier to catalog our new records. In the next release, we could work on a larger project. here, creating new authority records via the UI. This is one of our high impact and high effort items, though amongst the items in that quadrant, it has a little bit of a lower impact because not all libraries create their own authority records, but it does play an important role in original cataloging workflows of some institutions. So the next on the list that we could maybe consider in this example is more robust configurable MARC validation rules. So this is one of the highest effort ideas, but also a pretty high impact because it would support the entire cataloging workflow. But the process of making all of the cataloging rules that you can think of configurable at some level is very labor intensive. So we probably shouldn't add any of our fill-ins here. Next is version history, both high in impact and effort. It's a large and important project. Maybe this is a case where we're going through planning and we decide we can split this feature up amongst a couple teams. That would give each of us a little bit more capacity to pull in maybe one of the fill-ins. So here in this example, we could pull in the save and keep editing to again enhance the cataloging record editing. So we've gone through and have worked on some of the original cataloging, especially of MARC authority records. So maybe now we can revisit with the larger project of expanding the configuration capabilities of managing authority files. So this could be similar in priority authority records, but it's relatively higher effort. The impact here is though this idea allows for greater support for a larger number of libraries, so it would have even greater impact on top of our original authority records. Because we've already done the work for the 008 contextual help in MARC bibs, in this case, we could probably leverage some of that as well as the MARC validation and add it to the same bucket of work. Finally is the idea of MARC templates. The reason this is at the bottom of our list, again, our relative ranking, is because there are some unknowns here. The most important note, however, about this item is that there is an existing workflow in Folio to speak to these use cases. So when thinking about these priorities, especially those in the lower right-hand quadrant, that's a critical factor because it may be a question of altering some workflows to fulfill the use cases, as opposed to developing completely new, potentially complex functionality, especially within the context of all these other priorities and the ever-growing list of priorities. And for all of these, and as we're going through and implementing, we also need to be sure to conduct some user acceptance testing to make sure to validate everything we've done, but also to generate new ideas for future planning. And this process, like all of those in software development, is quite iterative. So that is the impact effort matrix. Now we're going to go through and Joe and I just mention some additional techniques that we like to highlight. So Joe, I believe you are next. If you are speaking, Joe, we can't hear you over Zoom.
Sorry about that. This technology setup is very, very challenging. Okay. So the next prioritization I want to touch on very briefly is quite a departure from the previous ones. It's called Kano or Kano, and it is designed to prioritize features based on user satisfaction. This one requires a fair bit more work because you are creating surveys of users and you're creating a specific type of survey where you're asking users both, how do you feel about this feature and how do you feel about the absence of this feature? Which gives you a pretty good sense of like, so you can get a sense of like, I don't particularly feel good about having this feature, but I feel awful about not having it, means it's probably a required feature. If you have a cell phone, nobody gets excited about being able to make calls or send texts. It's kind of an essential thing. Without it, you don't really have a cell phone. On the flip side, things that people are unhappy about if they don't have it and very happy about it if they do, these are things like more memory, faster phone, just, straightforward, more is better type things. But then you've also got delighters, which are things that people don't miss if they don't have them, but they love them if they do. So that's kind of an exciting thing. And then the inverse, which is where people really hate the idea of having something. Where do not implement this. It will make me not want to have it. Which would be, I mean, I can think of a handful of examples, but yeah, just don't do that. Like, let's add more spyware. Who wants that type of thing? The advantages to this is it is very user focused because you're going out to the community and to users and getting facts. You can then justify, you have hard data, you can quantify it, you have very clear rankings of what's going on, and it identifies work that you really want to avoid doing, but it requires some training. So you can't just go out and do Kano. You have to first learn how to do Kano, how to write the questionnaires and then interpret them. It is a little bit slower than some methods, and it is very focused on functionality. So if you're looking for like functional features, it's great. For less functional stuff, it's less great. But it's really useful for, you have a large list of features, you want to figure out what are the most beneficial things, where should we focus our time. Kano is really, really good for that. If you know generally what you're working on and you want to figure out where people will get the most excited, that's really good for that. Pass this on to Christine.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. So the next one, very different from Kano, is buy a feature, or it's sometimes known as the $100 test.
Oh.
In this method, the goal is to engage a large number of people to help identify the most valuable features within a community. So here, each participant is allocated a specific number of points, such as 100, where they can spend it or divide amongst a list of features. This, one of the biggest pros about this one is that it supports collaborative prioritization with, so potentially building some consensus around the priorities. However, on the flip side, it can be kind of time consuming and it can be difficult for a wide variety of people to determine subjective value without more data to drive those decisions. Despite these cons, it's a really good method if there are a lot of wish list items in a backlog. Maybe they are varying ages as far as like how long they've been in the backlog, or a lot of different ideas or goals. So it's a good way to build consensus and then to visually see this is how a community of people views these priorities. Very unlike by a feature or even our matrices that we introduced at the beginning is RICE. So this method, along with the next one, has the goal of determining an objective value like Kano. This one, RICE, stands for reach, impact, confidence, and effort. Each feature is evaluated through each of these metrics. And then in order to come up with an overall score, the sum of reach, impact, and confidence is then divided by effort. So the whole idea here is that it's more data-driven and it minimizes subjectivity. However, calculations can still be inaccurate and still include some opinions, and you can't get rid of all subjectivity. It also might not put enough weight on qualitative feedback from users. And but a good use case for it would be that after you've launched something, after you've implemented something, you have now more information, more data about it. So after you've launched all these things, you can have the data to then make more data-driven decisions. But again, collaboration is not really built into this method. The final one is ICE, which is a very similar, quicker and simpler version of RICE. This one has impact, confidence, and ease, often on a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 10. So still mathematical in nature. You're trying to assign a score to then rank amongst all the other items. But it's a little bit more subjective, and it doesn't include as detailed of data. This is great, though, because it's not as time consuming. It's simpler. It doesn't need as much training to do it. It, of course, is more subjective. The values that are assigned, these numeric values, can differ between participants, and it doesn't have as detailed data. But unlike RICE, conversely, this one, ICE, could be used when there are early decisions we need to make, but we don't have the data, the hard data to back it up as much. All right, so those are all of the techniques we wanted to share today. Thank you so much for coming and listening. We would be happy to answer any questions you may have.
So there are no hands up in the room. Oh, there's a hand up. Yay. Or I can just repeat it. So the question is, as POs, what do we use to gain feedback from users to get the best bang for the buck? That is an excellent question. And it's something that we kind of struggle with because it's very easy for us to get kind of in our own narrow headspace and do our things. I'll let Christine speak for herself. For me, I try to remain actively engaged with the community, particularly through relevant special interest groups. The acquisition SIG is very active in that regard, and we've done some pilot work with regard to things like, so we use Jira to, or are you part of the Folio project? Okay, so we use Jira. We have voting on features, which is kind of related to the buy a feature thing. We also discussed proposed work in the various meetings. But so we do a great amount through the SIG for getting this sorts of feedback. We also will occasionally put out surveys and use user acceptance tests. And part of our user acceptance testing includes questions for what have we missed? What would you like to see in the future? That kind of things. That's generally the way that we do that. I'll pass over to Christine for additional comment.
Well, my additional comment is rather boring, Joe, because I think we do the same thing. We definitely engage the SIGs. In my case, it's a lot of the metadata management SIG. In the past, we used to meet about a specific SIG or subgroup for QuickMark, the metadata editor. In that we discuss existing features, but then new ideas are brought up and generated, like Joe said, after things are implemented or are in the process of being implemented. The most important step, or one of the most important things, is the user acceptance testing, because that makes sure we've gotten it right, or there aren't any big bugs that we've missed, or maybe we need some ideas for the future. How do we improve it in future releases? So the great thing about Folio is the access to the community and a wide variety of people. So I would say, like Joe, the biggest help is engaging with the special interest groups.
I should also point out that we are aware that there are limitations of SIGs because, and I don't want to pick on anyone, I really don't. But I do find, after attending numerous SIG meetings, it is not at all uncommon to have 30 or 40 people in the room every week and to hear the same 6 or 7 voices every week. So please, if you don't want to speak up in the rooms, there are tools in Confluence. There are tools in Jira. These are community resources. These are shared resources. If you see a feature that's in there and you have questions about it, concerns about it, you can comment. And if you do comment, it's usually good to do an @ whoever's name is either the reporter or the assigned PO for the feature. You can do that. You can post comments in Confluence. And I did a presentation last year with Tom, who's at the back of the room, talking about community engagement. And what's important to mention is we don't hear what you don't say. And every voice matters. Everyone who uses the program, everyone who uses, Folio or whatever product you're working with, if you use it, your opinion or your feelings are valid and valuable and important, because we're building for everybody and not for just the handful of voices that speak a lot. And please do speak a lot, but they say the squeaky wheel gets the oil. Everyone needs oil. No, that came out wrong. Yes.
Thank you for that answer. I think both of you, it's clear you're wanting to hear. But what I didn't hear is how you engage the developers. So I wonder if you could talk about the developers and how they fit into that feedback loop and some of the assessment to do the prioritization.
So the question is, he understands we engage with how we engage with the community, but how do we engage with the developers and how do we bring them into that feedback loop? And Christine and I are both with EBSCO, so we are full-time POs. And I may want to pick on somebody else in just a few minutes, but we have daily stand-ups with the development team, and we have regular feature refinement with the development team. So it is a constant, ongoing conversation we have between the product owners and the developers, where when a new feature comes to new feature comes to light, we have a good understanding from the community of what they want to see happen. Then we write that up to a full feature. At that point, we bring in the developers and we have all of our developers take a look at it. Our QA starts asking questions about how that ought to work. What should happen if this happens? Are we understanding this correctly? Then they'll say, it's going to take about this amount of work. And once and they'll talk about different approaches, different technical approaches. Based on that feedback, we'll go in and we'll write the detailed stories, the detailed individual pieces of work that need to happen, and start figuring out the order in which they need to happen. Then we go back to the team and do the whole process all over again, but at a much more granular level. So this isn't just periodic engagement, it's every day we're talking with the developers about what's going on and what needs to happen. Having said that, Christine, if you don't have, do you have anything to add to that? Okay.
Nope, all said.
I'm going to pick on Tom, who's hiding at the back of the room. Tom is a community PO, so he has a day job for his employer. But he also helps out as a product owner. And so Tom, you can either come up here or I can just repeat what you say, however you want to do that.
Agrees sort of prioritization scale you show there was some form of effort that was always moved in with it. And the devs will throw that effort rating out the window. Because sometimes you'll think that something is low effort, high impact. You get it to the devs, and then all of a sudden it is still high impact, but the effort is 3-4 times what the part was, just because of the complexity of the system.
Yeah. So what Tom said was one thing to remember with the prioritization techniques mentioned is that once the devs view it, they will change the effort calculation, and it will usually be higher effort. Although I have encountered situations where, like, I was thinking it would take, a week and a half to do it, and they're like, that's easy, I can do it in a day. But those are the rare exceptions. But yeah. Tom said those are the days he buys lotto tickets. But yeah, good question. Okay, and I see that we have 1 minute remaining. So are there any, yes, one last question. So the question is, do we use any of the techniques for documentation? I don't work with the documentation working group, so I can't speak to that necessarily. So I guess the answer is, I don't know. Christine, do you have any idea?
I would say, if I understand the question correctly, do we mean how to prioritize which documentation is created?
And the right answer would be
So the clarification is not just is also finding the right process for the documentation, the right version of Folio, the right test processes, and so forth.
There are a lot of layers to documentation. The types of documentation, the goals, the audience of each type. I think that as a product owner, personally, I will definitely write documentation at a feature level. So permissions you might need, if there's API calls, how to construct them, the general overview of the feature. And then there are others, the documentation subgroup that Joe mentioned, that provide another lens to those being introduced to Folio or want a different level of information. So it depends on what the goal and the audience is as far as documentation that I create.
All right. And with that, we are past time. So thank you everyone for attending, and yeah, have a good rest of the conference.
Thank you so much, everyone.